Okay, we are ready to talk about instructions for review and preview 1.1.4. We start off with question 28 that shows us a table of values, and interestingly enough, it's talking about winter temperatures in Urbana, Illinois, and asks us to use the data and kind of brainstorm some questions to come up with. So for part A, it says to create a question. So I'm writing a question that could be answered by using all of the data. And this is something that we did touch on during class a little bit. So think of a math function or a math idea, something that I could do to include all of the data to answer my question. So my question should be starting off with what is or how do. So I'm making sure I'm starting with a question word. And since it's a question, we've got to make sure that it's with a question mark. Part B says create a question that could be answered using just some of the data. You've got to be very careful to make sure your question only asks us to use maybe specific data points, or you could choose to maybe look at the very largest value or the very smallest value. Those would be examples where you are only using part of the data, not all of the data. So again, for part B, make sure you're starting off with a question word, and because it's a question, we are going to finish it off with a question mark. In part C, it's asking how could you organize the data to answer your questions. Depending on what your questions are, you may or may not have a good idea on this, but here's what I do want to point out. Currently, the data is already in order by year, so it's chronological order. So if you're looking at the data, what would be another way we could order the data besides the year? So that might be something that gives you an idea there for question 28. When we get to question 29, it shows us a histogram of the same data from question 28. And the histogram is set up like this. We've got snowfall in inches across the bottom. We see the number of years over here on the vertical axis. Now, just keep in mind that this first bin represents 0 to 4 inches. The second bin represents 5 to 9 inches. And the third one represents 10 to 14, and so on. So for part A, which range of snowfall measurements occurred most often? You're looking for the largest bin. Which one was the most popular? Part B, were there any years with unusually high or low snowfall amounts? So you either have to start with a yes or a no. And if you say yes, maybe give me an example of the one or ones that you see. For part C, half of the years had snowfall amounts above how many inches? Before you can figure out half of the years, we need to know how many years there are total. So a reminder, this bin shows me 1 year. This shows 5, 2, 3, 6, and 3. I need to know how many years there are altogether. Then I can figure out what number is half of that. And once I know what half of that would be, where do I see half of the data values? Maybe half of them are above 15, or half of them are above 20. You've got to be able to figure out where they are and tell me what amount they were more than. Question 30. Question 30 shows us some number patterns, and it asks you to complete those number patterns by filling in the next 4 terms. And I've already got the ... here at the end because we're going to assume that those patterns will continue. After you figure out what the pattern is and find the next 4 terms, it asks you to describe the pattern in words. So for example, it's not enough, it's not acceptable to say times 2 or plus 7. If you're going to describe to me the pattern, a good way would be to say, start with 2, for example, start with 2 and add 10 repeatedly, or multiply by 2 repeatedly. So I'm going to explain what the pattern starts with. Start with 1 and I'm using math words. I'm not going to say plus 2, I would say add 2. So keep those terms in mind there as you work on question 30. For question 31, if you haven't already read the math notes box, it's a good place to check out because it gives you some reminders about rounding. Question 31 gives you 4 decimals, and in parentheses it asks you to round to a certain place. So for example, in part A, it asks you to round to the nearest 100. So keep in mind that's a digit in front of the decimal point, not after. Hundreds, not hundredths. When you're rounding, we find the place we're rounding to, we look at the backdoor neighbor and we decide, is it 5 or higher? That means the one in front's gonna round up. But if the backdoor neighbor is 4 or less, that means the digit in front is going to stay the same. Anything that's back behind where we're rounding off to will become 0, and everything in front of where we're rounding will stay the same. So again, that's something you probably already know about, but again, the math notes box is a good place to check for some reminders. Question 32 shows you a graph. It's a line graph showing us some change over the course of a day. And part A asks you, what do you think Ben was doing between 7 a.m. and 8 a.m.? So between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock, the line goes up fairly steeply, which means he's going farther away from home at that time of day. Part B, what do you think Ben was doing between 9 a.m. and 2:30 p.m.? So from 9 a.m. to about 2:30 p.m., we see this line flatten out. So at that point, that means from 9 a.m. to 2:30 p.m., he's not going farther away from home, he's not going closer to home. It must mean he's staying in about the same place. So what do we think he's doing during that time of the day? Then part C asks, what time did Ben leave to return to his starting point? So his starting point would be back at home. What time did he leave means we're going to try to pinpoint about what time would that be right there when we see this rapid decline to get him back home. So that is Review and Preview 1.1.4.